I climbed a tower, and then he climbed a tower. I drank out of a Reese's mug, and then he drank out of a Reese's mug. I became the chairman of the FCC, and then he became the chairman of the FCC. Ladies and gentlemen, the future CEO of CTIA and the current chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, my good friend, Brendan Carr. Oh, Mr. Chairman, it is great to have you with us.
It's good to be back with you, reunited, just like the good old days.
Just like the good old days, yeah. I know. It's unfortunately, it's a lot more quiet this time around, but right. Nonetheless. Now, they've listed a question here that I'm supposed to start off with. I'm going to scratch that. Ajit Pai, great chairman, greatest chairman. Yeah, I don't think that's really appropriate for conversation now. But
well, I will say this on this score. Like you, I'm active on social media, on X. Someone recently said that I'm going to go down in the annals of history as the worst FCC chairman in the agency's almost 100-year history. And I responded, I said, look, I spent a lot of my career making you look good, and why stop now? So I'm boosting your rankings as I go along here.
I appreciate that. Everything you do, it really, by comparison, I suspect makes me look a little better in retrospect. But, but in all seriousness, you've been a tremendous leader in your time at the commission. And even in our earliest days working together, you saw the future as being a wireless future and leader on wireless infrastructure, so many different issues. Right now, we're focused, of course, on spectrum, among other things. And I thought you might spend a second just talking about your spectrum agenda. How do you see it evolving for the administration writ large and for you at the FCC? And how do we push back on Chinese leadership in this sector and just get America innovating again in this space?
Yeah, this is sort of the tale of two cities, I guess, the good news and the bad news. I'll start with the bad news is, the reality is we have fallen deeply, deeply behind China when it comes to one of the most important features of national security, of economic growth, which is spectrum. Right now in the US, we have roughly 380 megahertz that are available for exclusive 5G high power use. China has 4 times that amount of spectrum. When you look at sort of the key mid-band spectrum right now, the federal government has over 60% of that spectrum that they either have exclusive access to or otherwise can access. Unlicensed spectrum that cable uses a lot, something like 30% of that spectrum, of the key mid-band spectrum, is there. But when it comes to sort of exclusive 5G full power, it's only 7%. And so right now we are just way out of balance. And we are far behind not just China, but we are 13th out of 15 when you look at leading economies in terms of available high-power mid-band spectrum. That's just not good. We are totally exposed on this peninsula where China is set because China very clearly views spectrum and everything that flows from that as a key part of their geopolitical leadership going forward. They're investing in it. So the bad news is, particularly over the last 4 years after you left, we just fell deeply, deeply behind China. The good news is we have a playbook that we've used before to turn things around because this is the same spot we were in 2017. When you came in as chairman in 2017, we had a grand total of 0 mid-band spectrum at a point in time in which China and other countries had 300 megahertz or more. And we executed very quickly on a plan you developed, the 5G Fast Plan. President Trump leaned in and said, I want America to lead the way on 5G. Even back then, presciently, he talked about 6G as well, which is we're on the cusp of now. And we did that. We turned things around. We leapfrogged China. Speeds increased. Prices are down. And so the bad news is we have fallen deeply behind China. That's unacceptable to me. The good news is we have a playbook that we've used before that we need to get going on. Now, there's different features of it today. Among other things, our Spectrum Auction Authority has lapsed. I think one of the most important things we can do for the economy right now is to restore our auction authority. If we do that, a couple things are going to happen. One, it scores. So if you're looking at reconciliation, there's a lot of things that folks want to pay that are federal priorities, whether it's deficit reduction, border wall, tax reform. And if you add the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority, it's at or in excess of $80 billion. So we absolutely have to get it done. It's an imperative. When we move more spectrum out there, it's deflationary. It drives prices down. When we have extra spectrum out there, a lot of the mobile providers are using it to go into the in-home broadband market. Again, back in 2017, we had probably 0 effectively fixed wireless homes served. Today, we have an excess of 10 million. And so people talk about what is 5G doing? I mean, 10 million homes served with 5G and fixed wireless is real, because when you're going into places that previously were monopoly cable homes, we're seeing significant decreases in price from having that fixed wireless option. So again, good news, bad news, and the status quo is not acceptable. We got to get going.
I couldn't agree more, and I talked about this in my own opening remarks. So the president has really set a bold vision in this space, both in the first term and hopefully too in the second term. And you're mirroring that, of course. I saw recently you gave an interview on CNBC where you talked about your agenda for the first 100 days and focused in part on spectrum. And you're putting action behind these words. The very first open meeting, you teed up some of the critical mid-band spectrum assets you just talked about, including the upper C-band. And I thought you might spend a second just talking about those airways, why they're so important, why it's primed for auction, and why you're not waiting to see what other actors do. You're actually pushing ahead as aggressively as you can.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the first 100 days have been obviously very, very busy at the FCC. We're moving on Trump time, and I'm actually grateful for the FCC's career staff. They've been executing on our agenda really well. We've done a couple things right off the bat. One is we're trying to work to unleash new high-speed builds, not necessarily a wireless issue per se in every single case, but we have all these legacy rules that require broadband providers to invest in sort of old copper networks. We're trying to shift that investment over into new high-speed IP. But unleashing more spectrum is top of the list as well. We're moving forward on an auction of AWS-3 spectrum. As you indicated, we've started a notice of inquiry to look at the upper C-band. This was one of the biggest spectrum wins that we had when you were chair. We freed up what I call the big kahuna, the C-band spectrum. That's being used today, again, to bring families across the digital divide. And we're taking another look at whether there's more spectrum in the upper C-band that we can free up. And again, that'd be a really good win for the country if we can get that done.
Well, it's not just adding to the ledger, you're also deleting as well, or deleting, to coin a phrase. You've been really forward-thinking in terms of your deregulatory vision for the agency. You've gotten a whole bunch of suggestions from across the industry, I'm sure. Could you talk about how you see the future of that particular initiative, and in particular, if you want to break some news here, why you're going to prioritize CTIA's asks over those of NCTA, US Telecom, some of the other associations. But obviously, objectively speaking.
It's funny, in years past, we had an FCC chair that once famously said that we need to take a weed whacker to all regulations. In my view, we need to sort of, plant some new seeds over here. We need to prune over here. But the reality is, if you look at the Code of Federal Regulations right now, if you stack it up for the FCC's rule, it's about this thick. And I think we really need to sort of decrease that. And that's one of the things that we're looking at. So we have this proceeding, as you noted, in-ray, delete. And if we can sort of get rid of these regulations that really only hold back investment, I think that's going to be a great thing. President Trump has been very clear. He wants companies to invest in America. He wants companies to build in America. And that's why at the end of the day, what we're running is a build agenda, whether it's spectrum, infrastructure reform, deregulation, the space economy. Those are the contours of what we're trying to get done right now.
Well, speaking of building, I mean, you touched on it a little bit just now, infrastructure. You're a leader on wireless infrastructure, and I think one of the unheralded successes of our time working together was a lot of those wireless infrastructure reforms you put in place were upheld by the courts and are now delivering major value.
Even in the Ninth Circuit, if you can believe it.
You worked your magic, I have to say, which is really impressive. Looking forward, how do you see the future of infrastructure reform? Obviously, the president has put out a bold vision in terms of getting rid of some of the roadblocks of permitting and approval that are standing in the way of deployment that would ultimately benefit wireless consumers. How do you see the future of infrastructure reform under your leadership going forward?
Yeah, look, I think there's at least three key pieces. We talked about spectrum on the one hand, workforce is another important piece of it, but that third piece is permitting reform. And I think there's a lot that we can do there. As you noted, back in the first Trump administration, we cut an awful lot of regulatory red tape that were slowing down builds. And that's one of the main things that we want to tackle again, is we did a lot of reforms back then focused specifically on small cells. I think we need to take a look at expanding that relief to other forms of wireless and wired infrastructure. I think that's going to go a long way. Federal lands has always been a challenge, a little less direct regulatory authority for the FCC there, but we need to make some progress. The further west you go, the further rural you go, the more federal lands there are. That's always been difficult, but permitting reform is going to be one of the big things that we look at doing.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything we haven't had a chance to talk about in the wireless space that's important to you? Obviously, we think of wireless as a platform for all of this innovation that's coming in terms of AI and all the next generation technologies that are out there. But is there anything in particular that's on your mind as you seek to position the U.S. as a leadership in wireless that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think that last point that you mentioned, AI, the sort of data demands have been increasing like a hockey stick on our networks, obviously for years. But as AI gets loaded onto these networks, that hockey stick just goes completely vertical. And it's very, very important to the Trump administration that U.S. lead the way on AI. President Trump's been clear about that. Vice President Vance has been clear about that. You know, the alternative is China. And we've already seen what China wants to do with their version of AI with DeepSeek. If you ask it what happened at Tiananmen Square, they say nothing, was a great day. If you ask them, you know, how the Uyghurs are doing, they say they're great. They're in, you know, camp-like settings, getting a wonderful education. You know, that's sort of the dystopian, you know, ideological version of AI. We want it to develop in the U.S. To lead the way. But to do that, we have to make sure that it works on our mobile networks. And so I think when we think about the future of AI, when we think about the networks that we need to build, we need to have the spectrum necessary, the infrastructure necessary so that AI can be mobile. And I think that's really one of the key things for this industry is to make sure that AI works on our smartphone. And again, that's on us in the government. We need more spectrum. We need more permitting reform. But that's kind of where we need to drive to.
Well, you've given us some great insights. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I just want to thank you for spending time with all of us today. I hate that phrase thought leader as applied to you because, yes, you're thinking big thoughts, but you're actually doing. You've been extremely active in 3 months. Can't wait to see what your wireless agenda is going forward and how we can help support you in the mission. So keep up the great work and let's stay connected, so to speak.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, buddy.